Arab Bedouins' prophecy. From millennium past, there were two types of Arabs, city dwellers and Bedouins. Bedouins are nomads. They travel through the vast deserts and are constantly on the move. Even during the golden age of Islam, when Arabs were the richest and most learned people on earth, Bedouins remained in virtually the same state that they had been for thousands of years, poor, uneducated, and cut off from the rest of the world. Yet Muhammad, peace be upon him, foretold that these Arab Bedouins of his region would one day compete with one another in the construction of tall buildings. "Now tell me of the last hour," asked the man. The Prophet replied, "That you see the barefoot, unclothed Bedouins competing in the construction of tall buildings." Today we find in the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouins who used to be impoverished herders of camels and sheep are now not only competing with one another, but also the entire world to construct the world's tallest buildings. How did one of the poorest people on earth, who literally wore rags, become the wealthiest nations on earth? One thing that made this rapid change possible was the discovery of oil. The seemingly empty deserts of the Bedouins had it in abundance. They went from camels to Cadillacs in a single generation. The construction of tall buildings among the Arab Bedouins has even reached Mecca, Muhammad's city of birth. The last few decades have seen a massive surge in building construction in Mecca. The famous Mecca clock tower is currently the third tallest building in the world. In order for such construction to be possible, many of Mecca's ancient mountains had to be demolished in order to make room for the tall buildings that had sprung up. Amazingly, this is also something that Muhammad had foretold. He said, "The hour will not be established until the mountains are moved from their places." This tremendous feat of demolishing entire mountains has only been made possible in the 20th century with the advent of technology such as explosives. It's important to point out that Muhammad himself was a simple man and wanted other Muslims to maintain that simplicity. He did not like Muslims to be extravagant. So, if he wanted to will this prophecy to become true, he would have to encourage the Arabs to build tall buildings, yet he never did. Spread of sexual immorality and disease. Muhammad, peace be upon him, revealed that the Day of Judgment would not take place until sexual immorality had become so prevalent and normalized that it would begin to be carried out even in public places. He said, "The hour will not be established until people fornicate with each other in the road, just as donkeys fornicate." Today we live in a world where we are being constantly bombarded with explicit sexual imagery, be it in TV, film, or advertising. And with the advent of the internet, pornography has now become readily available at any time in any place. In fact, we are finding more and more stories in the news of people being arrested for having sex in public. And an interesting side note is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, described what will be the consequences of such widespread sexual immorality. He said, "Never does sexual perversion become widespread and publicly known in certain people without them being overtaken by disease that never happened to their ancestors who came before them." The increase of sexual immorality has seen the emergence of previously unheard of diseases such as AIDS, just as the Prophet Muhammad had forewarned. A world steeped in interest. Muhammad, peace be upon him, claimed that the practice of interest would one day become so dominant that even those who try to avoid it will still feel its impact. He said, "A time will come upon mankind when they will consume interest. Whoever does not take from it will be afflicted by its dust." This clearly describes the state of the world economy today. In the modern world, it is almost impossible to avoid dealing with, or at the very least being impacted by, interest. Just think about how many people have interest-bearing bank accounts and buy things using credit cards. Even if one somehow manages to avoid dealing in interest directly, almost every aspect of our lives is impacted by it. Central banks influence the purchasing power of our money, and virtually every country in the world, even those considered to be wealthy, are drowning in interest-based debt. The financial system even suffered a global collapse in 2008, a disaster which had plunged the world into economic turmoil, the consequences of which will be felt for generations to come. What makes this prediction amazing is that the financial state of the world over the last century is unique in history. At the time of Muhammad, Finance was based on commodities with intrinsic value, such as gold and silver coins. Gold and silver have been used as the most common form of currency throughout history. The use of paper money with no intrinsic value, along with the massive debt and interest that it has resulted in, is a phenomenon of modern finance, and not something that could have been easily guessed by Muhammad over 1400 years ago. The defeat of Rome and the conquest of Persia. During the Battle of the Trench, where Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his followers were under siege by their enemies, being outnumbered 3-1 and staring in the face of certain defeat, the Prophet made some bold predictions. He said, "God is most great. I have been given the keys of Syria. By God, I can see its red palaces at the moment. God is most great. I have been given Persia. God is most great. I have been given the keys of Yemen." At that moment, Muhammad had made the astonishing claim that the Muslims would not only take the lands of Yemen and Syria, much of which was under the occupation of the Roman Empire, but that they would also defeat the mighty Persian Empire. Historically, Muhammad's companions saw this prophecy fulfilled before their very eyes, as they went on to defeat the Romans and conquer Persia. What are the odds that the Muslims, who lacked economic and military strength, could topple the superpowers of the world in such a short span of time? The astonishing way that the Muslims defeated the superpowers captured the world by surprise. As historian Barnaby Rogerson explains, you have to remember that the two great superpowers were the Byzantine Empire, i.e. the Eastern Roman Empire, and Sassanid Persia. They were the dominant superpowers. If you're putting it in a modern parlance, it's a bit like the Eskimos taking on the United States of America and Russia. No rational person would have ever conceived of such a possibility. This sentiment is echoed by historians who cannot explain how Islam became such a dominant force so quickly. Professor of Byzantine Studies, Andrew Louth, wrote, "The speed with which the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire succumbed to the Arabs remains to be explained by historians.